I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 78 of EO Radio Show. This is the 11th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on state filings in Nevada, Arizona, Washington State and Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine and Vermont, Rhode Island and New Hampshire, Florida and Louisiana, and most recently North Carolina and South Carolina. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in Kentucky and Tennessee. You can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there is a playlist just for state filing requirements. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. And this is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we are focusing on ease of formation, standardized documents, if any, that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we have discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in Kentucky or Tennessee, or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through a nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in these two states. For the details on these states, we welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Welcome back to the show, Joe.
Hey, Cynthia, it's good to be back again.
So let's start with Kentucky today. How does the new organization form in Kentucky? What's the document we start with?
So the Secretary of State is what governs Kentucky entity formations. And their forms are not numbered, but they have titles, initial titles like what they do. So they have a Form NAI, which is the Articles of Incorporation for a nonprofit. And this is for their domestic ones. It's a one-page form, and it covers a lot of the basics we've been seeing as we've started this survey. Address, purpose of the corporation, the agent, your formation date. It does ask for the name and address of the directors in this initial formation, but the address can be a P.O. box. I know we've talked about having to have a street address, but here it's only a need for a P.O. box. It also notes that per Kentucky law, there must be a minimum of 3 directors. So we've seen a couple states that have had a minimum in their actual laws, but it's not common. So be aware of that. I know some of our private foundations, we like to only sometimes have 1 or 2 directors. So here you're talking, you will need 3. Article 7 specifically of the form notes has an end for additional articles where we would put our IRS 501c3 language that we have. And the form directions note here too, if this form does not comply with the articles of incorporation that you wish to file, like having additional articles or signatures, please disregard the form and send a drafted, executed copy of the articles of incorporation according to KRS, that's the Kentucky Section 271B. This is sort of what we do. We've talked about when we do this in California, where there isn't necessarily enough room in the form. So we do it as a Word document that has all the language and does the articles. So Kentucky very much says if you think you have more additionals besides where you want to put your 501c3 language, by all means, type up something and send it to us, which is nice to know.
Yeah, so you can do your own. You can write your own adventure there. You don't have to follow the form. Okay, that's cool. That's flexible.
They also have an interesting checkbox that we haven't seen before to indicate whether the nonprofit meets the state's veteran-owned business exemption. And here, a nonprofit business, which is at least 51% unconditionally managed by one or more veterans under KRS 14.8.2, the fee for any filings is waived for a business that's veteran-owned. So that's kind of an interesting carve-out there in Kentucky.
Yeah, that's new. I haven't seen that before.
Okay. And then for our foreign nonprofits, the state form is letter FBE, the Certificate of Authority for a Foreign Business Entity. And that's where our FBE comes in. In some of the states we've seen before, we had a form that was for corporations, both profit and nonprofit. But here, Kentucky, it's one form for all foreign entities. It's corporations, it's nonprofits, it's LLCs, it's even business trusts. It's just a one-page form that has a checkbox, again, with about 10 different types of entities. And it asks for your address, agent, your state information. And then Section 8 has a space for the entity's representatives, which would include secretary, officers, and directors.
All of those?
Yes, so it does want you to have all of the secretary, any officers, and any directors that you have at that time of the filing. So,
all right, and I'm guessing that address can be a P.O. box.
That is correct. Both of these filings, if you're using the form again, they can be done online, and it is the preferred method in Kentucky, but they even have an online fill-in form that you can do this through, like a checkbox and type in your language. But the forms can be printed out and submitted. And as we talked about, the same thing you would if you were doing it as a Word version of the document, have that signed and you would submit that as well.
All right. Well, that sounds all pretty straightforward. So what's the cost and the response time for filings?
For filing domestic articles, it's only $8.
Wow.
But for the foreign certificate, it's $90, which again is not unreasonable. And per their website, normal processing time for the online is same day, but it can take up to 3 business days. And they do not have an expedite option with that. So,
all right. Well, still, it seems pretty straightforward. Are there privacy or transparency concerns in Kentucky? We talked about the P.O. box, but anything else that you noticed?
No, not particularly. Again, it's just names and addresses of directors and officers. And again, the address, yes, can be a P.O. box, which makes it very, very easy to keep your people private.
And so annual filings for the domestic and the foreign, is there an annual requirement?
Yeah, so annual reports must be filed with the Kentucky Secretary of State between January 1st and June 30th of the year following their first year of incorporation, and then every subsequent year thereafter. Each annual report will need to confirm the names and addresses of the officers and directors that we've already identified, and the fee is $15 for both the domestic and the foreign.
So that sounds pretty straightforward, and that's a big window. So if you just put it on your calendar with all their startup things for the beginning of the year, you can be done.
Yes.
Any other state agencies supervising nonprofits in Kentucky?
So they're in Kentucky. If the nonprofit is organized or if they're a foreign corporation which solicits, holds assets, or does business in Kentucky, you will need to be registered with the Office of the Attorney General. And then with them, you'll file an annual report attaching your IRS 990. Unlike where we discussed the Secretary of State, this registration with their Attorney General cannot be done online. All of this will be traditional print out, fill it, sign it, and send it into their office.
Just like California.
Just like California, yes. Additionally, for obtaining your tax exemptions, the nonprofit will need to apply with the Kentucky Department of Revenue. I've included, as always, links in the show notes to all these agencies and a lot of the specific forms that you can look at.
That's terrific. Thank you. I appreciate you pulling together all those good and useful links. Turning now to Tennessee, how do we start the process for a Tennessee corporation or a foreign corporation that wants to have a presence there?
So in Tennessee, also, it's their Secretary of State, which will govern the formations. Their domestic, they have a Form SS 4418, which is their charter nonprofit corporation. It's a 2-page form, and again, covers our basics, the address, your registered agent in the state. Some points of interest on this one. Section 5 does ask for the fiscal year close month. So you do have to identify that. And probably are thinking about that anyways when you're forming, but this really puts that in the forefront even before you're doing your IRS 1023 and where you have to identify that. So they want to know when your close of the month is. Their Section 8 is a checkbox with 3 different items. First, whether it's a public or mutual benefit nonprofit. Second, whether it's a religious or not religious corporation. And 3, whether you will have members or not. They have all this popped out to start to segregate things into their boxes on the form itself. Section 11 notes only that the incorporator needs to be identified, including their address, at least in this initial filing. Section 12 is a checkbox if the nonprofit will be designated as a, quote, school support organization. This is what allows for the filing fee to be waived in Tennessee. So you've got another exception here for that. And again, if that is something that you're considering, obviously we would look deeper into Tennessee law to see if you meet the criteria to be a school support organization. Section 13 is a blank space for, quote, provisions regarding the distribution of assets under dissolution, unquote, which is, again, our IRS 501c3 language. And Section 14 has an additional blank space for other provisions. And there had enough space to be fairly robust in both of those. So it was, I think you could get away with here not having to drop down into an additional document with the space they give you with those two questions.
Great.
For a foreign nonprofit in Tennessee, you would file the Form SS4432, which is an application for certificate of authority for a nonprofit corporation. This, too, is a 2-page form, mimics a lot of what we see in the domestic articles. Section 5 here also asks for the fiscal year close month. Section 8 is a checkbox with 2 of the items we talked about, whether it's a public or mutual benefit and whether it will have members or not. So looking at that, thinking about then, you could not be a school support organization in Tennessee if you were a foreign corporation. They're not giving you that option here. Then sections 11, 12 ask for the officers and directors and their names and addresses, and it needs to be signed by either an officer or director. Tennessee offers the option of e-filing or printing out the forms and mailing. They do emphasize that online is easier, but it is not as e-file forward as many of the other states we've looked at, like when we looked at North and South Carolina last month.
But it's doable online.
Yes.
What's the cost? And having 2 different options, maybe there's a difference there.
Yeah. The filing fee for the domestic in Tennessee is $100, but the foreign is actually $600. So you've got quite an uptake there. The preference, again, was for the state for you to file online. And then if we look at that, if you file online, there's an additional online service fee of 2.29% of the amount of the transaction if you use your corporate credit card, and 95 cents if you use an e-check. So if you have your bank transmittal number and drop that in, they'll charge you 95 cents more, which, again, 95 cents isn't too bad, but 2.29% adds up when you're doing $600 filing. So, and it's math in your head while you're just trying to pay your...
It's a lot of additional detail to figure out. Might as well write a check and send it in by paper, right? Unless the timing is really different. So what about the timing for the filings with that in mind? We can do it online and pay extra, or drop it in the mail.
As of April 10th, per the Tennessee website, they do track their filings on theirs. As of April 10th, they would process all filings through April 3rd. So they're about 5 business days behind. Discuss this a little with some of the services, and their online is generally 1 to 2 business days. And if you mail it in, it's generally 3 to 4 business days after receipt, all of which, again, falls into the idea that everything that they have in hand is done within 5 business days. So.
Yeah. Okay. So you can save a little money and mail it in, but it's going to take a little bit longer.
Yes.
Privacy, transparency for these Tennessee filings. How much public information are we going to have to put out there at this stage for the officers and directors?
So as we noted, when you do your foreign application, you need to identify all your officers and all your directors. And while you don't do that in the initial filing for the domestic, when you get to your annual report, you will have to name all your officers and directors there.
Okay, so that's a good segue to the annual reporting requirements. What does that look like in Tennessee?
This goes back to why they've asked you for your end of year, because the reports are due annually by the first day of the 4th month following your fiscal year end. So if you have your traditional calendar December 31st fiscal year end, then it's April 1st is when your annual report is due. So if you do yours at the end of June, that would be October 1st.
Okay,
yes.
So that now I understand why they're so seemingly obsessive about knowing when your fiscal year end is.
Yeah.
Because they slot you then into annual filing requirements. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And here, this is a report that must be done online. They say it must be, but you can print it out and mail if you don't want to pay the online fees. They kind of push that it must be, but there are options if you go in a little bit further. It took me a minute to figure that out. So it's not on the top of that. But again, you can do that. And here, the fee is $20, whether you're domestic or foreign. And then the same thing, the 2.29% would affect here if you do it online.
All right. Well, they're consistent.
Yes.
So other state agencies regulating nonprofits in Tennessee, who's in charge there?
In Tennessee, if you're organized there or if you're a foreign corporation soliciting, holding assets, doing business, you'll need to register with the Secretary of State, but they have a specific charities division. And they have an excellent handbook that's available online that I've linked in the show notes. It's about a 150-page PDF of a lot of different things there. So it's really exciting. And with that, it's a good reminder to always check the most current online information, especially, and even necessary, call the state, because we had this because we do have a charity registered in Tennessee, and they recently amended their laws and simplified their renewal requirements with the charities division. Previously, a nonprofit would be required to disclose financial information on a state-specific form 6 months after the end of the fiscal year, and you would have to parse that out of your IRS 990. You may recall we did this with the CPA for our client, where we had to parse out from the 990 to what exactly had come from Tennessee. Now you're only going to have to attach your IRS 990 and keep it at that top level, and they will do any distillation from that looking at it rather than you having to provide that part for them. So that's really nice. And that becomes in effect July 1st, 2024. So that's why we like to keep up on the laws.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.
Same thing. The Department of Revenue handles all the state tax exemption requests, and they have a couple of very specific departmental documents that, again, we put in the show notes. So you've got a lot of show notes for both of these states this month.
Well, this is terrific. Thanks again, Joe. I really appreciate you running down the details on these two states to add to our little collection. So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to resources in Kentucky and Tennessee and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Farella, Braun, and Martel has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including the one we are building where all the state filing episodes will be in one place. So look for that link in the show notes as well. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thanks again, Joe, for joining us, and thank you to the listeners. Until next time, make a difference.